And welcome to the Patricia C. and Charles H. McGill III Class of 63 Distinguished Lecture in International Studies. First of all, it's just wonderful to be back together in person. So what a joy. And tonight, we're honored to welcome Craig Whitlock to continue the tradition of prestigious scholars sharing their work at this signature event. Here this afternoon, we are also honored to have Pat and Charles McGill, class of 1963, and Trinity parents, 1994. Many of you know Charles as a nationally recognized expert in merger and acquisitions and corporate strategic planning. In addition, Charles and Pat share a passion for international studies, globalization, and the value of intercultural communication. I'm not sure I can read much more.
Now you have to.
And international relations. That came with intercultural communications. But before I continue with this brief introduction, I want to recognize not just Pat and Charles, but there's so many members of the class of 1963 who are here, and many with their spouses. So please, if you are a member of the class of 1963 or a spouse or a widow, just wave your hand, whether you're honorary or real. That is what years of dedication, friendship will do. People wanted to be here to celebrate with Pat and Charles, and welcome to all of you on our campus. And yeah, there's plenty of space down here. It's just wonderful to see it fill up. Charles and Pat, we are deeply indebted to you for your generosity. It is wonderful to have you on campus again. Truly, it's wonderful to be in person and to see the faces of friends. It's wonderful. The McGill 63 International Studies Fund was created in 1996 with a generous commitment by Pat and Charles that we were able to use to secure matching funds from the National Endowment for the Humanities. The fund supports the appointment of visiting humanities scholars, primarily from outside of the U.S., in all of the concentrations comprising international studies: African studies, Asian studies, Latin American studies, Middle Eastern studies, global studies, and Russian and Eurasian studies. I will now turn it over to Associate Professor of History and International Studies and Chair of the History Department, Seth Markle, and Matin Yakubi, class of 2023, to introduce our distinguished speaker. Did I pronounce your name correctly?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. You can move this away because I don't think you need it.
Okay, thank you. Hi, everyone. I'd like to start by thanking my advisor, Professor Markle. Take my mask off. For giving me the opportunity to speak with you all today. And I'd also like to thank Mr. Whitlock for being here with us today to share his invaluable insight on what's happening in Afghanistan. So the current narratives around what is currently unfolding in Afghanistan continue to center around a largely accepted idea that Afghans have no one else to blame except for themselves. Afghanistan armchair experts blame Afghan soldiers for the swift handover of power, pity the plight of Afghan women who are perceived as helpless, and paint Afghan men as savage and barbaric. What these narratives fail to include are the nuances of how foreign interference, including from the US, UK, NATO, and Pakistan, have, de- have for decades directly contributed to destabilizing the country. Afghanistan is a country the size of Texas that global superpowers have been trying to control for their own benefit for longer than I have been alive. We have been victims of a global war between superpowers since 1797. After the Taliban takeover, the U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan Reconciliation, Zalmay Khalilzad, the mastermind behind the U.S.-Taliban agreement, said Afghanistan is the responsibility of Afghans. This slogan, your country, your responsibility, is nothing but hypocritical. Where was that in 1979 when the U.S. armed religious extremists to fight the Soviets? Or in 2001 when the U.S. used women's rights as a tool to invade and the burqa as a justification for their U.S. imperialism? While the U.S. left behind a country in chaos and bears some responsibility to set things right, there's a group of radicals that has captured the country that is doing active damage to the rights of the people. For example, by denying women the right to an education, persecuting minority groups like the Hazaras, and putting terrorists in charge of law enforcement. When the Taliban regained control of Afghanistan last summer, the leadership committed to restoring peace in the country and protecting the rights of women and other vulnerable populations. However, they have continuously failed to fulfill their promises. It is still Wednesday, March 23rd, for many Afghans, the day secondary schools were supposed to reopen in Afghanistan, but didn't. With young girls waiting outside school gates, some already in classrooms, Taliban extended the ban. The war in Afghanistan is unlike any other war. It is waged to whittle away at the very last strain holding together the idea of a country. It is a slow-moving eradication of a people. It is meant to break a people. It is meant to fragment, cow, and break us, so that one day we cease existing altogether. And another generation of Afghans currently being kneecapped. Our best minds are traumatized, lost, and in pain. I often look at my fellow Afghans and wonder who they would have been and what they would be doing if we didn't have the wars of the past 40 years. I look at them and try to see counterfactual versions of them. Close friends instead of enemies, scholars instead of fighters, bonded in friendship and love across communal and ethnic lines, distinguished elders in warm homes, living children and grandchildren, instead of alone in poverty and mourning. Rosy-cheeked children in kindergartens and not a single one homeless and orphaned. Don't let anything derail your focus from the atrocities being committed in Afghanistan, even as the world's attention is rightfully on Ukraine. I share this condensed version of Afghanistan's story as a starting point for the world to start listening more closely to Afghan voices and mobilize with us as allies. So what can you do to be a better ally to Afghan people, not only today, but into the future, knowing that foreign interference and imperialism and falsehoods spouting from the West about Afghanistan will continue? First, read. Educate yourself on Afghanistan and its beautiful culture. I also urge you all to learn about the war and its antecedents. Read, witness, and try to understand. There's the suffering recorded and there's the suffering between the lines unrecorded. Our collective instincts have been wrong for so long. Keep its fallibility in mind, keep its costs in mind. Secondly, help Afghan evacuees and resettle refugees in your areas. Organizations such as Searing and IRIS are actively looking for volunteers. Let it be this way then, that we do all that we can and to help and welcome the Afghans who must make new lives in our midst, far from home. It is the least we can and the thing we must do. Third, consider donating to Afghan-led charities and nonprofit organizations working directly on the ground, such as Learn Afghanistan. Finally, email your representatives and hold your government official accountable. Urge the Biden administration to take immediate steps to ensure vulnerable Afghans have pathways to safety. Foreign governments must be held accountable for enabling the humanitarian crisis that is unfolding now. And what has been happening for the past 20 to 40 years, part of keeping foreign governments in check is for their populations to do their part in staying educated and vocal about Afghanistan. As an Afghan, I call for the public, particularly in the West, to take responsibility in learning and understanding how colonial history is at the crux of the inevitable abandonment of Afghanistan. We need peace and reconciliation now, but the solution is not to bomb the country again or starve its innocent civilians by putting unnecessary sanctions that do more harm than good. Our soil is still red with blood, our cemetery is full. Now more than ever before, Afghans need their allies. If the West does not do its part to listen and support us, not only will the 40 years of Western occupation of Afghanistan and the countless sacrifices made by the Afghan people be in vain, but Afghans Afghan lives will continue to be lost and in danger. And the time we're here, the best we can do is keep our hearts soft, be kind, seek to understand, seek to forgive, do as much good as you can. Thank you.
right. Can we give one more round of applause for Martine? All right, so thank you so much. Greetings, everybody. My name is Seth Markle, and I am an associate professor of History and International Studies, as well as the current director of the International Studies program at Trinity College. Please turn off your cell phones or put them on silent, just a little reminder before we get to our talk. And as we all know, we lost a member of our Trinity family last Thursday, Jillian Haggerty, and I would like us to take a moment of silence in her honor. All right. Thank you very much. So thank you for joining us this evening. This has been a long time coming. 2 years to be exact. 2020, our McGill lecture was canceled. 2021, it was held virtually, which was nice, but not the same as far as the sort of community, the communal nature of this day. So I'm very happy to be here and very excited about this evening. Before we get started, because we are in person, please, in the spirit of President Burger Sweeney, person behind you, front of you, just say hello. Hi. Hey, there we go. We're a little rusty. So here we go. Thank you, President Burger Sweeney, for those kind words about the program, as well, kind words about the McGill family. And can we please give Burger Sweeney a round of applause for what she's been doing for the past 2 years. I'm going to be recognizing a lot of people. I feel like we need appreciation for the type of community that we've been holding together. I would also like to thank Kate McGlew, Linda Minoff, and Kristen Wowernoff for helping to organize this event. Can we give them a round of applause, please? And I'd also like to recognize the faculty members of the International Studies program who are here with us today. Can you please raise your hand and be recognized? We have Professors Antrim, Bauer, Chen, Irake, Jogani, and am I missing anyone else? Myers in the back, and Milmanda Fernandez. Thank you so much. Can we give them a round of applause, please? And then, of course, a special welcome to the class of '63, and we can give them a round of applause as well. So on behalf of the International Studies program, I would like to express our sincerest gratitude to Charles and Patricia McGill for their support and contributions over the past 21 years. By extending our assistant professor fellowship to 2 years, this is the first time the McGill postdoctoral fellow, in this case, Professor Gunasena, could you raise your hand, please, has attended a distinguished lecture. So she will be here with us next year delivering our 2023 distinguished lecture. So thank you very much for the McGills and all their support. As an important space for rigor and deep intellectual engagement, INTS takes seriously our commitment to inquiry across the global South, including the critical interrogation of the Middle East. Since 2020, we all have been living through a fundamental paradigm shift, one that is beyond measure overwhelming to think about and think through. It's hard to think about what it means to go back to normal. And it seems that we're trying to define what that normal is as it's being transformed by two ongoing pandemics, one of ignorance and one of war. Craig Whitlock is here with us today to shed considerable light on both. The title of his lecture is called Devoid of Fundamental Understanding of Afghanistan, Mr. Whitlock has been a staff writer for the Washington Post since 1998. He is assigned to the investigative desk, where he specializes in national security, and is the author of the book, The Afghanistan Papers, A Secret History of the War, published by Simon and Schuster, 2021. At the Post, Mr. Whitlock covered the Pentagon beat for the national desk from 2010 until 2016. Before that, he was the foreign correspondent and served as the Berlin bureau chief for 6 years. While overseas, his primary assignment was investigative reporting into terrorism networks and counterterrorism policy in Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia. He has reported from more than 60 countries. He is recipient of the George Polk Award for Military Reporting, the Scripps Howard Award for Investigative Reporting, the Robert F. Kennedy Journalism Award for International Reporting, the Investigative Reporters and Editors Freedom of Information Award, the German Marshall Fund's Peter R. Welch Journalism Prize, and the Futrell Award in Communications and Journalism from Duke University. He is also a 3-time finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Please give a Trinity welcome to Mr. Whitlock.
Seth and Mateen, thanks for that very kind introduction. I'd also like to say thanks more broadly to Trinity College for graciously inviting me to give the McGill Distinguished Lecture in International Studies. It is truly an honor to be here, and I'd like to say thank you especially to the McGill family, which has been such a gracious host during my time here. I've been really enjoying getting to know them, and also to Professor Seth Markle for arranging all this and helping me come here and set all this up. I really appreciate all of you for hosting me and giving me an opportunity to speak about the U.S. war in Afghanistan. I recognize that global attention in matters of war have shifted to Ukraine in recent weeks and the unfolding tragedy there. But it's as important as ever that we do not avert our eyes to what is happening in Afghanistan today and America's role and responsibility for that country's fate. First, by full disclosure, I'm not a scholar, I'm a reporter. And as we were talking about at lunch, reporters only know how to do 2 things. We know how to ask questions, and we can write a sentence. That's all you need to know to be a journalist in America. So I'm not someone with an advanced degree. I've been a reporter my whole adult life, and that's what I know how to do. But this book, The Afghanistan Papers, it's all based on that. Anybody could do it. All you have to know is how to ask questions and write a few sentences, and voila, there you go. But I just want to give you that perspective. I am a journalist, a reporter, and that's my job, is to go around the world asking questions and writing stories. My reporting on the Afghanistan Papers began way back in the summer of 2016. At the time, I had no inkling that I'd end up writing a book. I had just joined the Post's investigative desk after spending the previous 12 years covering the Pentagon and as a foreign correspondent in Europe. But I'd received a tip from a source that an obscure government agency, the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, that's quite a mouthful, but this agency had interviewed current and former government officials for a lesson learned study about the war in Afghanistan. It caught my attention for several reasons, but mainly because I felt that journalistically, there was a pressing need to take a deeper look at what had already become the longest war in American history. At that point in 2016, the public had stopped paying much attention to Afghanistan. President Obama had declared an end to combat operations in Afghanistan, which wasn't true, and he had also promised to withdraw all US troops by the end of his second term, which clearly wasn't going to happen. All of which raised a simple question: what went wrong? I'll spare you the details about my reporting battles with the government, but long story short, the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan had interviewed more than 400 people who had played a key role in the war. Generals, White House officials, diplomats, aid workers, Afghan officials, 400 people. But the Inspector General had kept virtually all of the interview transcripts and notes confidential. the Post had to file 2 lawsuits in federal court under the Freedom of Information Act, but eventually, after 3 years, we obtained 2,000 pages of documents. And that's what's different about this book about Afghanistan. It's all based on primary source material, based on documents. It's not based on me doing interviews. These are based on government documents or oral history interviews. So that's what makes this book a little different. But these documents that we obtained after going to court were pretty striking. They were unvarnished, raw, brutal assessments of what had gone wrong in Afghanistan. There was lots of finger pointing, backbiting, venting, but for the most part, people were forthright about the failures of the 2 decades that we were at war. Even though the US government had been telling the public for years that they were making progress in Afghanistan and that victory was inevitable, these documents showed that US officials knew the war had been unwinnable for more than a decade, and that the Bush administration and Obama administration in particular had committed a series of strategic blunders. Let me read from a couple of these documents just to give you a sense of how scathing they are in their self-assessments. This is from an interview with Ambassador Richard Boucher. He was a former top diplomat for South and Central Asia during the Bush administration and also a spokesperson for the State Department during the Clinton years. This is what they look like. It's just a heading, notes of the interview. This is how it starts out. Let me approach this from 2 directions. The first question of, did we know what we were doing? The second is, what was wrong with how we did it? The first question of, did we know what we were doing? I think the answer is no. First, we went in to get al-Qaeda, and to get al-Qaeda out of Afghanistan, and even without killing bin Laden, we did that. But the Taliban was shooting back at us, so we started shooting at them, and they became the enemy. Ultimately, we kept expanding the mission. We did not know what we were doing. That's top diplomat for South Asia, for that part of the world during the Bush administration. Here's another one. This is from an interview with Army Lieutenant General Douglas Lute, who served as the so-called Afghan war czar at the White House under Bush and Obama. So he was a 3-star general in charge of war policy at the National Security Council under 2 presidents. Here's what he said. I bumped into an even more fundamental lack of knowledge. We were devoid of a fundamental understanding of Afghanistan. We didn't know what we were doing. What are we trying to do here? We didn't have the foggiest notion of what we were undertaking. It's really much worse than you think. So here's a 3-star general, top diplomat for Afghanistan, both saying we didn't know what we were doing. I mean, how much plainer can you put it? So I was a reporter, I've been a reporter a long time, when I read this, their own words in these documents, they just leapt off the page at me. I mean, you always assume as a citizen that maybe the government screws things up, but somebody knows what they're doing or is trying to know what they're doing. But these are the guys in charge admitting, no, we didn't know what we were doing. It took the Washington Post 3 years to get these documents. We had to go to court for them. So that's pretty blunt. General Lute was highly critical about a number of aspects of the war, but he spoke at length about how the United States wasted enormous amounts of money trying to rebuild Afghanistan. The United States spent more money trying to rebuild Afghanistan than it did in Western Europe after World War II with the Marshall Plan. You know, with good intention to try and help lift the country on its feet, but it was done in ways that didn't make a whole lot of sense. Here's what General Lute said. We were building infrastructure in ways that Afghanistan could never sustain or even use in some cases. One poignant example of this is a ribbon-cutting ceremony complete with the giant scissors I attended for the district police chief in some godforsaken province. It was a U.S. Army Corps of Engineer constructed building with a glass facade and an atrium. But the police chief could not even open the door. He had never seen a doorknob like this. To me, this encapsulates the whole experience in Afghanistan. Now, there's a lot to unpack there. Here you have the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers spending probably millions of dollars on a brand new glass-enclosed police headquarters, but the Americans never bothered to ask the Afghans if it's what they wanted or needed. They held a ribbon-cutting ceremony like they do in the United States with the giant scissors, right, which I'm sure in Afghanistan they'd never seen before. And the police chief gets ready to go in his new headquarters, and he can't even figure out how to get inside because he'd never seen a doorknob like this before. Now, General Note calls it a God-forsaken province in Afghanistan, which is a bit of an attitude, some condescension there, but Lute was correct in his overarching conclusion. He said, we didn't know what we were doing. We were trying to build a new nation in the image of America without much forethought. More than any other cause, the United States lost the war in Afghanistan because of hubris and ignorance. For 2 decades, a global superpower with unrivaled resources failed to undertake the necessary effort to achieve even minimal fluency in Afghan society, history, culture, and politics. After the United States removed the Taliban from power in 2001, it pushed its allies in Kabul to design a new system of government and create a new army that closely resembled institutions in Washington, but were ill-suited for Afghanistan. The lessons learned documents from the Afghanistan Inspector General formed the basis for an investigative series that we published in the Washington Post in December of 2019. These news articles provoked a strong public response. Readers were angry to hear quotes like the ones I just read you. This was incontrovertible evidence that they'd been lied to about the war for nearly 2 decades. People wanted to know more, so I kept digging. I obtained thousands of other pages of other primary source documents, hundreds of oral history interviews from people who served in Afghanistan that had been compiled by the U.S. Army, the University of Virginia, and a Diplomatic Studies Institute. Most of these oral history interviews were unpublished or had not been widely circulated. But taken together, they underscored what Lute and Boucher had said so memorably. The United States simply didn't know what it was doing. According to the vast majority of these accounts, the hubris and ignorance were endemic. In reading these oral histories, you hear the same frustrations time and again. The United States' fundamental ignorance of Afghanistan was perhaps understandable back in 2001 when the war started. At the time, the Bush administration's decision to bomb Afghanistan was seen as a war of self-defense, a justified war in response to the 9/11 attacks that had been carried out by al-Qaeda. The United States was in a rush to understand where the threat was coming from and what to do about it. It possessed limited institutional knowledge about al-Qaeda and even less about Afghanistan. The U.S. Embassy in Kabul had closed in January 1989, shortly before the Soviet Union withdrew the Red Army from Afghanistan. During the ensuing 12 years, the United States' knowledge of Afghanistan dried up. The CIA had some external contacts, and the State Department kept a distant eye on Afghan politics from Pakistan. But that was about it. The United States really stopped paying attention after it helped drive out the Russians. One of the few Americans who possessed more than a passing familiarity with Afghan culture was a guy named Michael Matrinko. He was a legendary U.S. Foreign Service officer. He first visited Afghanistan in 1970 when he was in the Peace Corps. Basically getting stoned as a hippie is how he put it. He served for several years as a political officer in neighboring Iran, and he was posted to the U.S. Embassy in Tehran in 1979 when he and dozens of other Americans were taken hostage by revolutionaries. So in January 2002, the State Department rewarded him with a posting in Kabul. They sent him back to Kabul to help reopen the U.S. Embassy there and serve as head of the political section. Matrinko was fluent in Farsi, which is similar to Dari, one of Afghanistan's national languages, from his service in Iran, so he was a rare American diplomat who could converse with Afghans in their native tongue. Matrinko said in an oral history interview that Afghans learned that if they wanted to eliminate a personal rival in a power struggle or a land grab or a commercial dispute, all they had to do was tell the Americans that their foe belonged to the Taliban. This is what he said: much of what we call Taliban activity was really tribal, or it was rivalry or old feuding. I'd had this explained to me over and over and over again by tribal elders, you know, the old men who would come in with their long white beards and would sit and talk for an hour or two. They would laugh about a lot of the things that were happening. What they always said was that you Americans don't understand this, but you know, what they think is a Taliban act is really a feud going back more than 100 years in that particular family. Matrinko especially disdained CIA operatives who flooded into the country and tried to blend in. Quote, they had a lot of people who couldn't speak a word of the language and ran around in beards and funny clothes and thought they had a grasp of what was happening. I would dismiss them all, 99%, as amateurs, said Matrinko, who served 2 separate tours in Afghanistan in 2002 and 2003. Quote, as far as any real knowledge of what was happening, where they were, what they were trying to get done, the past, present, future, it was zero. Many troops and US diplomats, and journalists too, who traveled to Afghanistan for the first time after 2001, viewed it as a strange, exotic, hopelessly backward place. There was a strong undercurrent of condescension. In 2002, a Pentagon official named Roger Pardo-Maurer, a 38-year-old Yale-educated Green Beret, deployed to Kandahar with Army Special Forces. In emails back to the Pentagon, where he was a deputy assistant secretary, the civilian equivalent of a 3-star general, Pardo-Maurer mocked Kandaharis as, quote, a crusty lot of downtrodden moochers. He also memorably described Kandahar's suffocating summertime heat as, quote, a Venusian submartian environment of heat, dust, and parched air that stuns you, rasps your corneas, produces constant sinus clogging migraines and nosebleeds, and crackles your skin in weird, tender places. Does that sound like a travelogue or what? But this is a guy who's a senior official at the Pentagon, and he parachutes into Afghanistan, and you know, this is the American view of things. Quote, if there is a landscape less welcoming to humans anywhere on Earth, apart from the Sahara, the poles, and the cauldrons of Kilauea, I cannot imagine it, and I certainly don't intend to go there. In 2002, after the Taliban was removed from power, the Bush administration made a tacit decision to keep thousands of US troops in Afghanistan indefinitely. Part of the reason was to hunt for Osama bin Laden and the remnants of al-Qaeda, and the other reason was to try and stabilize Afghanistan. But the US government failed to make a concerted effort to overcome its institutional ignorance. Instead of trying to take the time to learn Afghan culture, languages, and history, it just became easier to dismiss the country as backward and uneducated. By 2003, however, this institutional ignorance was becoming an embarrassment. For example, as the US military settled into Afghanistan, it mobilized special forces teams to carry out operations to influence the emotions and thinking and behavior of ordinary Afghans. These were known as psychological operations, or PSYOPs, which I think most of you all have heard of. This is a long-standing form of unconventional warfare to shape popular opinion in favor of American objectives and sap the enemy's will to fight. The Green Berets and military contractors on PSYOP teams were supposed to study foreign cultures so they could exploit religious, linguistic, and social nuances to their advantage. But the PSYOP specialists and other soldiers who parachuted into Afghanistan were operating in the dark. Years after the war started, the US military still had almost no uniformed personnel who could speak Dari or Pashto fluently. Few troops possessed even a remote grasp of Afghanistan's history, its religious customs, or tribal dynamics. When Major Louis Frias, an officer with the 8th PSYOP Battalion from Fort Bragg, deployed to Afghanistan in 2003, he prepared by reading the paperback Islam for Dummies on the plane ride over. He taught himself a couple of phrases in Dari, but garbled them so badly when he got there that Afghans pleaded with him to stick to English. Quote, "I felt like a dork," he said in an Army oral history interview. And he's on the PSYOPs team. He's supposed to be the expert. But the PSYOPs teams were not the only ones who struggled to comprehend Afghanistan. Cultural ignorance vexed U.S. military units for the entirety of the war, hampering their ability to conduct operations, collect intelligence, and make tactical judgments. By the time they started to become comfortable in their surroundings, it was usually time to go home. Their untutored replacements repeated the cycle year after year. U.S. troops were supposed to receive a smattering of instruction in Afghan languages and customs, the cultural do's and don'ts, before they left the United States. But at many military installations in the U.S., officers said the training was worthless, or it was tailored for the larger masses of troops headed for Iraq, based on the misguided assumption that people in all faraway Muslim countries were the same. In 2005, Major Daniel Lovett, a field artillery officer with the Tennessee National Guard, reported for pre-deployment training at Camp Shelby in Mississippi. During his cultural awareness class, the instructor opened the PowerPoint presentation by saying, "All right, when you get to Iraq," Lovett interrupted to say his unit was headed to the other war. But the instructor responded, "Oh, Iraq, Afghanistan, it's the same thing." The indifference exasperated Lovett, who had been assigned to serve as an advisor to the Afghan army, and he hungered for insights. Quote, "Our mission was all about cultural awareness," he said in an oral history interview. "Our mission was all about developing personal relationships, so with legitimacy and credibility with the people we were trying to work with. I'll tell you, that was tough. It was a tough job. Were we prepared to go and do that? I'd have to say at the time, absolutely not." Training at other bases in the United States was usually no better. Army Major James Reese, who was part of a special operations task force in Afghanistan, said his instructors at Fort Benning, Georgia, tried to teach his class Arabic, which was widely spoken in Iraq, but a foreign tongue for the most part in Afghanistan. He said the training overall was a waste. Major Christian Anderson said the training at Fort Riley, an Army post on the plains of Kansas, was, quote, "horrible," and did nothing to prepare him for the task of advising an Afghan border police unit. Just from a geographic perspective, he thought the pre-deployment tactical training was foolish and lacked common sense. Quote, "I would say actually train your personnel as they're going to fight. Afghanistan has a lot of mountains, right? Tora Bora, Hindu Kush, all this stuff, mountains," Anderson said in an oral history interview. Quote, "Afghanistan doesn't have swamps, so why are we training soldiers at Fort Polk, Louisiana? Why are we training at Fort Riley, Kansas, where it's as flat as a dinner table?" Good questions. For the military, the lessons that did address the cultural nuances of Afghanistan as opposed to Iraq were often outdated or just laughable. Major Brent Novak, a West Point faculty member who served as a guest instructor at a military academy in Kabul, attended pre-deployment training at Fort Benning, Georgia in 2005. He had to sit through classes on surviving nuclear, chemical, and biological attacks, even though such threats were non-existent in Afghanistan. Afghan culture received only a cursory mention. One PowerPoint slide at Fort Benning warned against giving anyone a thumbs up sign because Afghans regarded it as a rude gesture. Quote, "When I got there, though, kids were giving me the thumbs up, and I was like, geez, are these kids flipping me off?" Novak recalled in an Army interview. After enduring a flurry of upright thumbs from the kids, the clueless American asked an interpreter to explain what he had done to cause offense. The interpreter looked at him like this and told him that a thumbs up meant way to go. As an institution, the US military stressed the importance of showing respect for Islam, the official state religion of Afghanistan, where about 85% of the population is Sunni Muslim. But the systemic lack of cultural and religious education meant some US soldiers held stereotypical or prejudicial views of the Afghans. Quote, "Theirs is a culture of dishonesty and corruption that seems prevalent in Muslim cultures going back thousands of years," said Major Christopher Plummer, who served in 2005 as a training and fielding officer for the Afghan army. Others saw Islam as intolerant and concluded it was impossible to bridge differences. Quote, "In the Islamic world, it's either my way or death. Everyone that's not a Muslim is an infidel, according to their Muhammad," said John Davis, a retired US Army officer who served as a mentor to the Afghan Defense Ministry. I want to stress that only a minority of US soldiers express these kind of views, but the overall ignorance of Afghan culture and society was so extensive and pervasive that US troops constantly struggled just to define or identify the enemy, a problem that persisted for the entirety of the conflict. Major Stuart Ferris, who was an officer with the 3rd Special Forces Group and served in Helmand province in the south in 2003, said his unit's mission was to capture and kill, quote, "anti-coalition militia," which was a vague catch-all term for the enemy. But his soldiers could not often tell who qualified as the enemy. In general, they just referred to the enemy as, quote, "the bad guys," without really knowing why someone was bad. Quote, "There was a lot of crime. It was hard to determine if folks were actually no-joke Taliban or just criminals," Ferris said. "That's where a lot of the problems were. We had to figure out who the bad guys were, whether they were in the scope of our mission, and who we were there to target versus just being criminals and thugs." Marine Major Thomas Clinton, who served in Kandahar, guessed that he probably spoke with a dozen or so Afghans every week without realizing they were really Taliban fighters. Quote, "At any given moment, you could find yourself in the middle of the Wild West. Guys would say that the Taliban were shooting at us. Well, how the hell do you know it's the Taliban? It could just be some pissed off local for all you know." Army Major Rich Gary, who led a company of soldiers in eastern Afghanistan in 2003 and 2004, said it took him a while to learn to slow down. Quote, "We'd come in like gangbusters, track down the village elder and ask him where the bad guys were. We were always told there weren't any bad guys there, even though we were very close to the Pakistan border. There were obviously bad guys out there, but we didn't go about it in the right way to get that information." Tellingly, the view is no clearer from the Pentagon. 2 years after the war started, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld wrote a memo to his top intelligence officials. Quote, "I have no visibility into who the bad guys are," Rumsfeld complained. "We are woefully deficient in human intelligence." Now, I've not served in the military and I'm not a military scholar, but if you can't identify or define the enemy in a war, especially in a war that you started, you're probably in trouble. And this wasn't just a problem at the beginning of the conflict. In 2009, the new US war commander, Army General Stanley McChrystal, spent weeks drafting a new comprehensive strategy for Afghanistan. It was a classified 66-page report that called for as many as 60,000 more US troops, double the number that were already there. But McChrystal's strategy glossed over that same unanswered question. Who's the enemy? The first draft of McChrystal's report did not mention al-Qaeda because the group had all but disappeared from Afghanistan, according to a NATO official who had helped with the review. Quote, "In 2009, the perception was that al-Qaeda was no longer a problem, but the entire reason for being in Afghanistan was al-Qaeda. So then we had to put al-Qaeda in the second draft." right? So imagine that, here's this comprehensive report given to the President of the United States saying, here's why we need to send 60,000 more troops. They can't even identify who the enemy is. And the first draft didn't even mention Al-Qaeda, which is the whole reason the United States was in Afghanistan to begin with. One of the biggest blunders committed by the US government came during the first few months of the war. In late 2001, the United Nations hosted a conference in Bonn, Germany to design a new political future for Afghanistan. With the backing of the United States, the United Nations invited all sorts of Afghan factions, the Northern Alliance warlords, royalists, other leading figures in the Afghan diaspora, and after weeks of haggling, delegates reached a consensus on an interim power sharing agreement and laid out a process for writing a new constitution and new political system. But the Bonn Conference and agreement had a fatal flaw that was overlooked at the time. It excluded the Taliban. At that point in the war, most US officials saw the Taliban as a vanquished foe, a misjudgment they would come to regret. Some Taliban leaders had indicated a willingness to surrender and engage in discussions about Afghanistan's future. But the Bush administration and its warlord partners in the Northern Alliance refused to negotiate. They labeled the Taliban as terrorists and said they deserved death or prison. Rumsfeld and Bush equated the Taliban with Al-Qaeda, even though the Taliban had nothing to do with the September 11th attacks. While the Taliban deserved its terrible reputation for brutality and religious fanaticism, it was too ingrained in Afghan society to eradicate. The Bush administration failed to understand this, as well as Afghanistan's history of resolving conflict. Todd Greentree, a Foreign Service officer who spent years in Afghanistan, said, quote, "One of the unfortunate errors that took place after 9/11 was in our eagerness to get revenge, we violated the Afghan way of war. That is when one side wins, the other side puts down their arms and reconciles with the side that won. And this is what the Taliban wanted to do. Our insistence on hunting them down as if they were all criminals, rather than just adversaries who had just lost, was what provoked the rise of the insurgency more than anything else." The Bush administration compounded the error when it came time for the Afghans to write a new constitution and establish a new form of government. US officials pushed the Afghans to consolidate power in the hands of a president with few checks or balances. Part of the reason was to curtail the influence of Afghanistan's many regional warlords. But more importantly, Washington thought it had the perfect man to install as Afghanistan's ruler, Hamid Karzai, who was an English-speaking tribal leader and CIA asset whom the Americans had taken under their wing. In oral history interviews, numerous US and European officials who were directly involved in the nation-building deliberations admitted that the decision to put so much power in the hands of one man was a disastrous miscalculation. The rigid system conflicted with Afghan tradition, which was typified by a mix of decentralized authority and tribal customs. Quote, "In hindsight, the worst decision was to centralize power," said a European Union official. A senior German official added that it would have made more sense to slowly build a democracy from the ground up, starting at the municipal level. Quote, "After the fall of the Taliban, it was thought that we needed a president right away, but that was wrong." A senior State Department official said in an oral history interview that he thought, the idea that an American presidency would work in Afghanistan made no sense. Quote, "You'd think they never worked overseas," he said of his State Department colleagues. "Why did we create a centralized government in a place that has never had one?" Even some other State Department officials said they were baffled. Quote, "In Afghanistan, our policy was to create a strong central government, which was idiotic because Afghanistan does not have a history of a strong central government," said one senior US diplomat. Quote, "The time frame for creating a strong central government is 100 years, which we didn't have." Richard Boucher, the ambassador and State Department chief for South Asia, the guy who I quoted at the beginning of the talk, added this, quote, The only time Afghanistan has worked properly was when it was a floating pools of tribes and warlords presided over by someone who had a certain eminence, who was able to centralize them to the extent that they didn't fight each other too much. I think this idea that we went in with, that this was going to become a state government like a U.S. state or something like that, was just wrong and is what condemned us to 15 years of war instead of just 2 or 3. Now again, there's a touch of condescension there about the Afghans and their history of infighting, but Boucher and other U.S. officials offered an even harsher assessment of American capabilities. In spite of their good intentions, Boucher and others said U.S. officials tried to train Afghan government officials to be, in effect, Americans, because that's all they knew how to do. This is Boucher again. Quote, "If you look at it after 15 years, we could have taken 1,000 Afghan school children in the first grade, well, not quite first, but 5th grade, taken them to get educated and trained in India, then we could have brought them back on an airplane by now and said, okay, you guys run Afghanistan. I'm not sure that would have worked any better, but it would have been better than having a bunch of Americans going in and saying, we can build it for you, with you, meaning you can come to my meetings and listen to me go on and on. So again, he's being sarcastic, but he's saying we made a hash of it. This idea that the Americans knew what to do, we're trying to build our government in our own image, been better off sending Afghan kids to India to get an education, bringing them back. And point taken. Many Afghans interviewed agreed completely and told story after story about the patronizing attitudes of U.S. officials. Safiullah Baran, who is an Afghan who worked for the U.S. Agency for International Development as a project manager, said the Americans were so intent on building things that they paid little attention to who was benefiting. He said the Taliban once sabotaged a bridge in Laghman province in rural eastern Afghanistan. U.S. officials were eager to replace it, so within a week they hired an Afghan construction firm to build another bridge. It turned out, though, that the owner of the construction firm had a brother who was in the local wing of the Taliban. Together, they had built a thriving business. The Taliban brother would blow up U.S. projects, and then the Americans would pay his brother to rebuild them. And this went on and on. Mohammad Ehsan Zia, who was a former Afghan cabinet minister in charge of rural development programs, said the United States and other NATO members just threw money at problems without taking the time to listen to Afghans. Quote, "Foreigners read Kite Runner on the plane and believe they are an expert on Afghanistan and they never listen," Zia said, referring to a best-selling novel about an Afghan boy who is haunted by oppression and ethnic strife. Quote, "The only thing they are expert in is bureaucracy." The US government's unfamiliarity with Afghan culture doomed even the most well-intentioned projects. Torialai Weza, who served as the governor of Kandahar province from 2008 to 2015, said US aid workers once insisted on carrying out a public health project to teach Afghans how to wash their hands. Quote, "It was an insult to the people. Here people wash their hands 5 times a day for prayers," Weza said. From a strategic perspective, the most critical nation-building project was the creation of a new Afghan army and police force. Over 2 decades, the United States spent over $90 billion to equip the National Army and paramilitary police. And once again, hubris intervened. The Pentagon committed a fundamental mistake by designing the Afghan army as a facsimile of the US military, forcing it to adopt American rules, customs, and structures in spite of vast differences in culture and knowledge. Almost all Afghan recruits have been deprived of a basic education during their country's years of turmoil. An estimated 80 to 90% could not read or write. Some could not count or did not know their colors. Yet the Americans expected them to embrace PowerPoint presentations and operate advanced weapon systems. Robert Gates, who served as the defense secretary under Bush and Obama, said US goals for the Afghan security forces were, quote, ludicrously modest during the early years of the war, and that the Pentagon and State Department never settled on a consistent approach. Quote, We kept changing guys who were in charge of training the Afghan forces. And every time a new guy came in, he changed the way they were being trained, Kate said. The one thing they all had in common is they were all trying to train a Western army instead of figuring out the strengths of the Afghans as a fighting people and then building on that. U.S. combat advisors gave Afghan soldiers mixed reviews on the most important issue, their willingness to fight. Some praised their dedication and determination, while others complained of laziness and indifference. Given that the U.S. war strategy depended on the Afghan army's performance, however, the Pentagon paid surprisingly little attention to the question of whether Afghans were willing to die for their government. Major Charles Abeyo-Wardena, who is a strategic planning officer with the U.S. Army, arrived in Afghanistan in 2005 to interview U.S. military trainers and Afghan officials about their experiences. As an aside, he decided to ask low-ranking Afghan soldiers why they had enlisted. He said their responses echoed those usually given by American troops. It's a solid paycheck, I want to serve my country, it's an opportunity to do something new with my life. But when he followed up and asked whether they would stay in the Afghan army after the United States left, the answers startled him. Quote, "The majority, almost everyone I talked to said no," Abeyo-Wardena said. They were going to go back and grow opium or marijuana or something like that because that's where the money was. That threw me for a complete loop. The US and European attempts to train an Afghan national police force were a disaster. On one hand, the US and its allies wanted to impose a Western-style system of law enforcement to maintain stability and order. On the other hand, the Pentagon wanted the Afghan police to fight insurgents much as the army did, and they trained the police as a paramilitary force. Either way, the notion of a uniformed police officer carrying a badge and gun to enforce the laws of the state was a foreign concept to most Afghans, especially in rural areas. Major Delsam of the Army National Guard said Afghans were accustomed to settling disputes differently. Quote, "If you have a problem, you don't go to the police. You go to the village elder," he said. "He makes up the rules as he goes. There's no rule of law. If he likes you, he's going to say, hey, this is really good. If he doesn't like you, he's going to say, give me some goats or sheep, or we'll have you shot on sight." In such situations, tribal or religious codes of conduct that had been in place for generations usually determine the outcomes. Inserting Western-trained police officers into the equation stirred disruption and trouble. Quote, "They have a hard time picturing what we're trying to do with the police officers. They don't understand how it fits into their cultures," Sam said. "Americans are trying to force something on them that we understand, but that they can't visualize." By the summer of 2021, as U.S. military withdrew from Afghanistan, many Americans were shocked at how quickly the Taliban swept through provincial capitals and seized power in Kabul. But even some senior Afghan officials, allies of Washington, had envisioned such an outcome. Around 2016, Shah Mahmoud Mirkel, who was a former senior official in the Afghan Defense Ministry, said he got an earful from district tribal leaders who said they couldn't stand either the Taliban or the Afghan government. They saw the Taliban as brutal and repressive, but they also saw the Afghan government as inept and hopelessly corrupt. I asked them, why is it possible that a large number of about 500 government security forces cannot defeat about 20 or 30 Taliban? The community elders replied that the security people are not there to defend the people and fight the Taliban. They are there to make money by selling their U.S. supply weapons or fuel, Mirkel said. He said he told the tribal elders, okay, the government is not protecting you, but you have almost 30,000 people in your district. If you don't like the Taliban, then you must fight against them. But their response was, we don't want this corrupt government to come, and we don't want the Taliban either. So we are waiting to see who is going to win. And with that, I'll be happy to take any questions you might have.
Can everybody hear us? Okay, great. So thank you. We're going to open this up for a question and answer. I'm going to start off first with a few questions. One that I asked you earlier when we were in the Trinity podcast studio. And then I'm going to ask a question from one of our international studies classes. They came up with a question to start off, and then we want to sort of open it up. But one of the things that you argue in your book is this idea of, being able to look at the history of this war over a 20-year period, which essentially entails 4 administrations, because you do cover the Bush administration, the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and then a little bit of the Biden administration. Given that we are in this sort of age of political polarization, which administration was the most egregious in lying to the American people and the world?
Well, everybody's laughing, but as the book I think makes clear, that was one thing they were all very good at, right? Was not telling the truth. And my argument is, I think the reason overall why it became very hard for all these presidents and their generals and diplomats to not tell the truth about what was going on in Afghanistan is, you have to remember, in 2001, just about the entire American population supported the war, understood it, right? There was this trauma from 9/11. There was this fear there could be additional attacks. So Congress voted almost unanimously. There was only one member of Congress who voted not to go to war in Afghanistan. Much of the world approved of the United States' decision that it was seen as a war of self-defense. Russia, China, Iran, countries that are normally hostile to the United States, they understood why the United States was defending itself, at least that was a perception, against al-Qaeda. And within 6 months, most Americans thought we had won the war. The Bush administration had said, okay, the Taliban's out of power, al-Qaeda's on the run, we're going to keep some troops in Afghanistan to try and stabilize things and look for bin Laden. But the country was really under the impression, been told that the war was successful. So from that point forward, when the war slowly starts to go badly, starts to go downhill, what president, what commander-in-chief wants to admit that on their watch, things aren't going well with a war that the vast majority of Americans had seen as justified and thought they had won? I mean, to admit failure on your watch on something that the whole country stood behind politically is very difficult to do. So even, we saw lying during Vietnam and Iraq too, but in Afghanistan, I think it became especially hard even when a new president came in and took over, because they were inheriting a war that Americans thought, we had good reason to be there, that it was to defend the country and go after al-Qaeda. So even though you had different presidents, the reason you saw the deception in the lies is because nobody wanted to take ownership of the fact that the war wasn't going well, and as the years went on, it became clear it was unwinnable. So I don't think it's possible to say, this book has example after example after example, but particularly Bush and Obama, they were both president the longest periods of time, and they each had their whoppers, they each did their spinning, but there's some pretty egregious examples in there of lies from the presidents and from their top officials.
Good answer. Right. So this is from the class International Studies, Women, Gender, Family in the Middle East, taught by Professor Bauer. Can we have those students who are here in that class kind of raise their hands, because they came up with this question collectively. And it reads, how can journalists, A, report the nuances of stories like Afghanistan beyond government narratives, agenda, in a timely and consequential way, and B, in doing so, collaborate with local reporters in getting their perspectives and stories heard?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and this is something we wrestle with every day as journalists. How do you get beyond the government narrative? And certainly reporters are skeptical, and they're trained, they're taught not to accept what the government says at face value. But it is very difficult in a moment, if the government's coming out, having a press conference and saying XYZ happened, how do you, you can challenge them, you can say, where's your evidence, but, how do you find out if that's true or not? And so you as the phrase goes in journalism, you try and run it down, you try and check it out. Is it true or not? Sometimes that involves having people on the ground in Afghanistan or other places. Sometimes it's just interviewing lots of other people who may have different viewpoints. But that's what you're constantly doing, is trying to figure out what really happened and checking out the official version. You would see this, and it's difficult sometimes, particularly in a war zone, because you may not be able to have access to a particular place where some event happened. And you'll often hear this about, let's take an example recently. This is in Afghanistan, but in Ukraine, the last few days, there have been reports of atrocities by Russian troops outside Kyiv. And some of the first reports came from the Ukrainian government. And reporters are trying to get there to see for themselves without taking the official version from the Ukrainians or the Russians or the Americans or NATO, trying to see with your own eyes. But even then, how do you, is what you're seeing reality, and how do you check it out? How do you prove something? And it's just this constant process of trying to check it out and interview as many people and places as you can. But I'll tell you, in Afghanistan, one of my frustrations covering the Pentagon for several years, from 2010 to 2016, this was during the height of Obama's surge in Afghanistan, when he sent over 100,000 troops. And he had this strategy where he was going to turn around the war. And he and his top officials and generals kept saying they were making progress, And they would characterize that things are going well. And as reporters, you'd see with your own eyes, like, that doesn't look like progress to me, or you're writing about events that are clear setbacks for U.S. forces or the allies in Afghanistan. But how do you have your own authority and your own confidence in your own reporting to challenge those events? And it's difficult. Sometimes you can't, if there's an airstrike that killed a bunch of civilians, right? You have to try and get there, and sometimes they're in remote places. And how do you find eyewitnesses, and who are you talking to, and does this contradict the government's versions of events? And you're just trying to get all of that. And sometimes it just takes layers and layers of persistent digging over time. That's really what this book is. This isn't news unfolding as it happened. This is having to write a book years later, and it took 3 years to pry these governments loose from the documents. So sometimes that process of reporting is slow to get at the truth, but you can't stop. You just have to keep going.
I do want to leave it open for questions from the audience. Please, if you could say your name before you raise your question. Please, sir.
Not a question, but it's often difficult to hear something from the other end. Could you repeat the question before you answer?
Will do. So in the green in the back there, is that Sam? Oh, sorry. I thought he was a student. He's masked. Oh, Sam's right there. So the question is, what could the U.S. have done differently at any certain point? I guess you can give different examples.
You think you meant during the withdrawal in particular.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it's a good question. And we were talking about this at lunch with the class of '63. I think really the last three presidents, Biden, Trump, and Obama, all wanted to pull out. And they were all really worried about what would happen if they did. There was this fear that the Taliban would take over because the Afghan government was weak and corrupt, and that despite this enormous nation-building effort to train and equip an Afghan army that could defend their own country, there was, they knew that it wasn't going to last, that the government would collapse. It was a question of how long. And so it became easier for Obama and Trump. they made the decision to keep U.S. troops here, even small numbers. So you didn't have as many casualties of U.S. troops, but the war was still going on. Conversely, the casualty figures for Afghan soldiers and police went way up. So as the Americans fought less, the Afghans had to take on more of the fighting. The casualties were terrible. The casualties for the Afghans were so bad that around 2015, 2016, the Afghan government stopped releasing that information and classified it because they were worried it would destroy morale. The irony is that even though there were fewer American casualties, the war actually intensified quite a bit during President Trump's time in office. There was, even though there wasn't as much fighting on the ground with Americans, the air war escalated quite a lot. There was more bombs dropped during the Trump years and even under Obama. So the air wars were very intense. Many civilians were killed, many Afghans were killed on both sides. Now, as to what could be done differently, this is a $100,000 question. Was there going to be an easy way to withdraw without there being the outcome that we saw? And I don't think there was an easy way. But I think the Biden administration really miscalculated because they thought the Afghan government would last for a number of months. They thought the Americans could pull out and the Afghan government would at least hang on for a while before the Taliban took over, that there'd be an interregnum or something. The big problem was, in retrospect, the United States should have started evacuating people much sooner. Afghans who had worked with the US government or US citizens or others who were essentially, they knew would be targeted by the Taliban. The reason they didn't start it earlier, there are a number of reasons. The main one was the Afghan government was worried if they would start evacuating Afghans, even while US troops were still there, that would essentially send the message that, look, the end's near, that it would trigger panic. And, there was legitimate concern about that. But I think the US under Biden clearly botched the withdrawal. They should have started evacuating people earlier. They didn't really have a plan in place to do this quickly. And so everything happened in a rush. And we all saw this unfold on TV. You have pictures of US troops in Kabul trying to guard the airport, trying to get people out while the Taliban's controlling the capital. I think that was an outcome nobody foresaw. People might remember that President Biden was asked in July of last year, he said, before the pullout was complete, he was asked, do you think this could be another Saigon? And what that was a reference to the US withdrawal from Vietnam, from South Vietnam in 1975, when the final US personnel in Vietnam evacuated from the roof of the US embassy in Saigon. And there were these television pictures of people hanging on the helicopter trying to get out. And Biden was dismissive of this. He said, no, that'll never happen in Afghanistan. And I think he believed that. He didn't think that would happen in Afghanistan. And yet you all saw that, the pictures of the US transport aircraft trying to lift off with Afghans running, trying to climb on board. I mean, it was just chaos. And it was, in some regards, it looked worse than what happened in Saigon. So clearly they misjudged what was going to happen. They knew that the Afghan government would collapse, but they thought it would last longer than it did.
Thank you. Charles?
Craig, this is a little bit asking you to project forward from your reporting, but the events that you have described, the confusion and almost scandalous stories that you read to us in part, as that became public, perhaps in part through your own book, but I don't know, and then the way Biden took us out of Afghanistan, not even leaving Bagram for us, how important do you guess or think that, or how does that relate to what is now going on in Ukraine and Putin's decision? Let's go now.
Yeah, I think
Purely speculative.
yeah, I think the point is, are you asking, did that factor into Putin's thinking? Yeah.
You're far deeper into this than Clifford after 3 years.
Yeah, I
Do
don't
you want me to
know.
repeat the question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, I thought
So, well, I have to say it again. Are you trying to make a comparison between Afghanistan and Russia's invasion to Ukraine?
No, I'm just saying, how much do we think, does our lecturer think that the events of that book and the confusion and the pretty bad picture that comes out for America as it would have come out for Russia years before we did this, but how important and significant do you think that might have been terms of influencing Putin's decision to let's go ahead and move on and not worry so much about us?
Yeah, I think it's a fair point. It's, given those events, they happened so quickly in Afghanistan where it didn't look good for America, right, in foreign policy. And did the Russians judge at that point that the Americans wouldn't push back if Putin invaded Ukraine, did this affect his strategic calculus? And short answer, I don't know. I mean, there's certainly been a lot of speculation about that. I think it may have played a role. You could actually, the counterfactual would be that while the United States was in Afghanistan, it actually solicited Russia's help and backing there sometimes, so that once the United States had withdrawn from Afghanistan, it didn't need Russia's support there. So it gets complicated. I think, I'm not an expert on Ukraine. I think Putin had come to this decision over time. I think he would have done it anyway, regardless of what was going on in Afghanistan. But it may have contributed to his thinking that look, the U.S. politically is in turmoil. They just pulled out of Afghanistan. Maybe they and their NATO partners don't have the stomach to push back if I go into Ukraine. That's certainly possible, but to what degree that was a factor, your guess is as good as mine.
It was Putin's long-term objective. We now know that. He was going to try to get there. Thank you.
Can we get the student in the back here with the glasses? Yep.
My name is Alex. So, as a former MP, I joined the Army in 2019. There was a lot of notion that the war in Afghanistan was like the fight of the fights. It was what we inherited, and a lot of people still thought it was ongoing. Since I've gotten out, a lot of my buddies have stayed and are currently in through the withdrawal of Afghanistan. A lot of them have, stated their anger or their disturbance about what happened. I was born in 1998. I inherited this war. This is all I've ever known. This is conflict in Afghanistan. From the time I can remember, we've been in Afghanistan or some country in the Middle East fighting. How are the effects going to be on the soldiers, of the kids, of the next war? Is there going to be another war? Like, how are we going to get past this? I appreciate your book that you published. But how are we going to get that to the people who, in the younger generation, to tell them that, there was more to the war than what they know? And that the war is a lot deeper. Because a lot of my buddies, I talk to them like, hey, the war's over. They're like, the war's never over. The war's always going on. We should go back there and finish what we started. So there's this level of these barriers. How do you break through those barriers as a reporter and, working for a major newspaper?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I'm sorry, you served as MP in the Army before you came to Trinity, is that right?
I was stationed in Fort Campbell.
And you had a number of buddies who served in Afghanistan, were there during the withdrawal, and there's a lot of understandable anger and frustration with how things turned out. But you're also pointing out that, your generation has lived with this conflict pretty much your whole life. And how do you make sense of it? And how do we tell the next generation what happened? Is that, and how do journalists break through those barriers? And it is difficult. I think most people remember during the evacuation in August that one of the worst events was when there were about a dozen Marines that were killed by a suicide attacker at the Kabul airport. And this was while the Marines were there trying to help Afghanistans evacuate from the country. And they knew they were in harm's way, right? They were there on a noble mission to help Afghans get out, but they knew there was a real threat from suicide bombers. And that was a severe loss of life that day. And many of those Marines were your age. Some of them I think had just been born after 2001. And to me that was, as a reporter you try and keep your emotions out of what you write about, but my son was born in 2000, and you think, gosh, what did we as a country do here? We got stuck in this war for 20 years, and here's these young Marines who volunteered to serve their country, and here they are, we put them in this situation, right? And this is all they knew, and they gave their life for a war that, we screwed up, that shouldn't have gone on that long. How do you break through that? How do you explain that to a new generation? And this is one reason I was really glad to get the invitation to come talk here, because most people who are younger than me, if you ask them, how did the war in Afghanistan get started? What was it all about? how do you even answer that?
Yeah.
Right? Why were we there? What happened? What went wrong? Those are pretty basic questions that most Americans under the age of 30 don't know. It's like my generation during Vietnam. It's like, oh yeah, Vietnam, why were we there again? What went on? How do we get stuck in this terrible war? And it's the same thing is going to happen with Afghanistan. And not to give you a succinct answer, but this is one reason I spent 5 years of my life digging. There's a lot easier stories to do than to, have to go after the government 3 years in court to get documents, and you don't know if they're going to pan out or be any good or not. But the Washington Post, to its credit, my editors said, look, this is important. This is what we're about. If we can't tell these kind of stories and get at the truth of why we were there and what went wrong, that's our whole purpose for being. So that's why we dedicate as much time and resources to write a book like this. And it's why ever since 2001, we've had reporters in Kabul. We still do to this day. Even after the Taliban took power, we had briefly for a few days, people left for their safety, then they went back in. We're still trying to tell those stories as best we can. Sometimes it's hard because it's, understandably people want to tune out Afghanistan. Right. That was like a national nightmare, right? But it's our job to tell those stories and get at the truth. And that's, honestly, that's what this book is an attempt to do, to explain to people what went wrong, and so they can read these documents for themselves and try and come to their own conclusions a little bit. And, and that's the advantage of writing a book versus a newspaper article that kind of goes up on the web and vanishes after a few days. A book has some endurance, hopefully, to it, that people can read for years to come if they want to find out more. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's my honest attempt.
Can I get young woman right here, please? I'll get you next.
Earlier, you mentioned an establishment relationship between government deception and formulating American public opinion. But I want to ask, in your investigative work, did you find an inverse relationship where American public opinion acted as a pressure or an influence on the way government responsiveness in Afghanistan was implemented?
So to what extent did American public opinion shape government's response to Afghanistan is the question?
That's a really good question. I'd have to give it some real thought to give you a smart answer, but I think you do see that constantly. Maybe it's at a lower level. I mean, the government, whenever they're making statements or assessments, it's with public opinion in mind, right? So a couple of examples. Throughout the war in Afghanistan, from Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden, you name it, the presidents and their top officials, they were all very worried about how the public would react to news of U.S. troops being killed, that they wanted to avoid or minimize U.S. casualties in a war. And this goes back to Vietnam and wars before that they knew that public support for a war would dry up if there were a lot of casualties, right? And I mean, you could talk about that all day, but what you would see then is the U.S. government, because of that concern that the American public would, react badly to news of U.S. casualties, as you saw repeated attempts, particularly under the Bush administration and Obama administration, to sort of gloss over what was going on over there. In 2003, Donald Rumsfeld, the defense secretary, declared an end to combat operations in Afghanistan. And it wasn't true, and I go into this in a chapter in the book, that even military officials in Kabul at military headquarters, when they heard Rumsfeld said this, they couldn't believe it. They're like, we've got combat operations going on all over the place. But Rumsfeld and Bush wanted to tell the Americans, make them think the war was over. Don't worry, your troops aren't at risk like they were. And Obama did the same thing in December 2014. He again declared an end to combat operations because he wanted people to think the war was pretty much over, but it wasn't. So I think in a reverse way, that's what's going on. The lies they're telling are in response to public opinion because they're worried how the public will act or would vote them out if they thought there was still a war going on with American troops at risk. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. So it seemed had a better strategy for the American public than strategy for war in Afghanistan.
I'm sorry.
I think they had a better strategy for the American public in terms of its response and this idea of
Yeah,
deception.
that's a good point. I think, I don't know if it was a better strategy, but they're more attuned to
A
it,
more effective
right? You know, they
strategy,
knew there's constantly a factor in their minds is the political effects, right? How is this going to play politically back home, rather than is this going to work in the field? I think that's a fair point.
We got room for about 2 more questions. We have you, sir.
Tom from class of '63. What do you see as the future for Afghanistan?
So what does he see as the future for Afghanistan?
It's hard to be very optimistic, and this is where I was really glad to hear from Mateen at the beginning. You know, his generation, I mean, we talk about our generation having fought there, but his generation and generations before and generations after are going to have to bear the scars of this war, not just the Americans being there for 20 years, but the Civil War before that during the 90s and the Russians there in the 80s, and it's hard to get your head around the amount of suffering and scar tissue that's built up for that country as a whole. You know, the Taliban being in power, I can't sugarcoat it. You know, it's really bad news for women and people who are opposed to the Taliban or anybody's free expression. It's not good. You know, the Taliban has not changed very much, it doesn't seem, from when they were in power in the 90s. The only silver lining, I guess, is, you know, I hope for Afghans' sakes that, you know, the fighting can stop. You know, there's been so much war for so long and so many families torn apart. I hope some stability can break out. I mean, I wish the Taliban wasn't there, but you know, if the war, the constant airstrikes and the night raids and the fighting would just stop for a while, you know, I think that would be a good thing. And I think Afghans deserve that. But you know, even now you have the Americans pulled out, and you have sanctions, and you have real fears of a famine in Afghanistan, and so there's going to continue to be this political and diplomatic squabbling going on, and the people who are going to suffer, unfortunately, are regular people in Afghanistan, and it's hard.
We have room for one more question, Ms.
The warlords create units which are very individualized, I think. You can correct me if I say anything that's incorrect, please do. And a lot of them are totally isolated because of lack of roads and lack of really any way to, and some of the warlords, they're like, it's head of a fiefdom, as you know more about it. But how can that possibly, how do they integrate with the Taliban?
So looking at the relationship between warlords and Taliban, because these are 2 distinct things, right? 2 entities. But are you saying about their coexistence or just their relationship?
I don't know how you can even have a government. Because as you said, you have to really understand that some of these people are still very isolated.
Yeah, if I understand your question, you're asking about, you know, we hear so much about warlords in Afghanistan. How can they coexist with the Taliban, and how can the country govern itself? And warlords is sort of I would say, a Western term of art, and it's used to describe, you know, there's no precise definition, but it's used to describe power brokers, right? Regional power brokers. These might be tribal leaders. These might be people who just amassed a lot of power, had their own militia. These can be heads of criminal syndicates. You know, they're really just strong men power brokers. For the most part, they are men. And some, you know, I think actually there's certainly, you could label some people leaders with the Taliban as warlords too, that they controlled their own groups of fighters and they became allied with the Taliban. So it gets a little murky, but this is Afghanistan, that you've had regional power brokers, whether at the provincial level, tribal level, or just, you know, controlled certain amount of territory or parts of the economy. And, you know, for decades or generations, they've been in competition, protecting their turf, figuring out how to coexist. You know, the Taliban, just like the Afghan government before it that the United States has propped up, essentially has to make their own deals in trying to figure out how to coexist. You know, that was I think that's an issue that happened long before the Americans arrived and will continue long afterward. I'm not an expert on those kind of politics in Afghanistan, but my sense is that'll continue.
And one thing I found so fascinating was this sort of terminology, right? You're reading through these oral interviews, the terminology, they're using terminology, insurgents and other things, warlords, Taliban, and thinking about the consistency of the use and sort of the new terminology that comes up depending on the administration. Did you find that was something that you had to sort of tease through
and this
work
is something
through?
we, at the Washington Post, we deal with quite a bit, is your definitions of things. You know, what's an insurgent, right? It's easy for the government to use it. Well, that's, you know, an insurgent would be somebody who's armed or has violent means trying to contest government control over something, right? Or, you know, a guerrilla. But you know, this is the fascinating thing to me. Even after writing this book, I still, every time I read these interviews or these documents where the Americans just call the enemy the bad guys, right? I'm just like, oh my God, you know, if that's all we can, that's our term, is we just call them the bad guys. I mean, good grief, we're really stuck.
Yeah, right.
But it just, again, it gets to, we just fundamentally didn't understand Afghanistan. I mean, there were plenty of bad guys who were on the U.S. side, who were on the CIA payroll, or who we propped up in government. You know, there were bad guys all over the place. There were good guys we were fighting. You know, it's just, it was very complicated, and it's very simplistic to throw a lot of these labels on. And at the Post and other journalists, they try and be as precise as you can. Even to use the term the Taliban, that became a catch-all term for insurgents opposed to the government. Now, you could say that the Taliban, there was a movement that had controlled the Afghan government in the 1990s that called themselves the Taliban. That meant the students, right? These were religious students. But, you know, there's a lot of factions that kind of allied themselves with the Taliban, but weren't necessarily have the same ideology. You know, you have these coalitions of groups that are constantly changing, and it's difficult to identify them with any precision. And then if you do go into that level of detail, you know, most general readers, you know, it gives them a headache, right? They can't keep track of all these different factions. But so that's a constant tension in trying to explain things in a clear manner so that general readers can understand, but you're also trying to be as accurate as possible.
Thank you, Mr. Whitlock. Can we give him a round of applause, please? Let me take your hand. Thank you very much. Please join us up the hill at the Academic Club for reception. And for folks who still had questions, you can try to ask them.
Yeah, please, I'm a reporter, and all I do is ask questions, so I would be remiss if I didn't field any questions you may have, so feel free.
Thank you, Craig. Appreciate it. That was great.